RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Rugby Renegade podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Pro Athlete Supplementation. Please check them out at pas-nutrition.co.uk for all your supplement needs. I'm Jamie Bain, and today I interview Jamie Tout, a great strength and conditioning coach from New Zealand who's currently working with the Black Ferns, the women's All Blacks team, in their build-up to the World Cup in the summer. And he's a really experienced strength and conditioning coach. He's got a great wealth of knowledge in sports science and monitoring, the work he does at VX Sport, and also he's an expert in multidirectional speed and agility for rugby and other sports, and that work over at xlr8sportstraining.com. So give it a listen and let us know what you think. Hi Jamie, welcome to the Rugby Renegade podcast. Why don't we start by you just telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into strength and conditioning and some of the teams you've worked with.
Thanks, Jamie. Mate, I've been in S&C now since early 2000s. I probably started off with about 20% actually high-performance athletes and about 80% Joe Public. And then I found a niche during speed and agility training, and set up a company called Accelerate. We design strength and conditioning programs mainly focused around how we integrate speed and agility skills, field-based skills. And it was probably at that point in time that my client base changed, and I ended up with about 80% professional athletes or semi-professional and 20% Joe Public. And over the years, I've sort of worked with a number of different sports through High Performance Sport New Zealand, and get contracted into different environments, whether it's rugby league, rugby union, to work with teams now, not just on speed agility training, but in more recent times through athlete monitoring and the use of GPS technologies, accelerometers, heart rate, that type of thing.
Yeah, so obviously, like, linear speed is pretty understand how to develop that, and you talked about like multi-directional speed. Now, how do you approach developing that so that it transfers into the game?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to always remind ourselves is what the game demands, and it's through better monitoring that we now understand how many sprints are in a game, how far they are, whether they're 5 meters to 15 meters, and are they starting from a static position or dynamic starts, and through that we can start to better develop our speed and agility programs. If we look at an Usain Bolt, who's got a top speed of around 44 k's an hour, he takes around 41 strides to run the 100 meters. He reaches his maximum speed every time a winner. He takes a relatively long time to get there, but once he is there, he holds that speed pretty much through to the end. And that's why we see he might not always be ahead at the 50, but as he wears the athletes down, he continues to maintain high speeds while other athletes drop away. Well, the rugby player is a completely different beast. They're heavier. They're going to have to absorb impact. They're carrying a ball. There's a lot more unknowns about sort of what the requirements are going to be on game day. So what we've seen is that the tight forwards are generally making sprint efforts of around so that 5 to 15 meters. A lot of those come from a stationary position, so they're getting up off the ground or sprinting away from a set piece. Whereas your outside backs, they will be doing a slightly longer sprint, so maybe 15 to 30 meters. Generally, there's a passive movement behind it. So they're already sort of got some sort of movement before they have to try and accelerate and sprint. And more, that's the game of rugby. It's all about accelerations, decelerations, and collisions.
Yeah, definitely. And what sort of training approaches would you implement to improve that?
I think we start with trying to have a good form, like in terms of trying to coach some sort of technique. In saying that, I don't think we need to make all the athletes look pretty. I think if something's effective and it looks ugly, but it's still effective and they're still powerful, then we work with that and try and not make too many really big gross changes. The only reasons for making big form changes I see in coaching's speed and agility is if it's going to cause an injury to the athlete or injury to another athlete. And then we sort of consider, well, what's the byproduct of changing the form or not changing it? once we've got that, it's no different, I guess, to developing strength. We work through a strength phase through using resisted sprinting. So I still use a lot of harness work. A, because it helps encourage good form, but B, I do like the idea of contrast training. So creating that load for a few meters and letting the athlete go. As a rule of thumb, if we're working with those tight forwards, it might be that we're working 3 to 5 meters of resisted work and then 2 to 3 times that unresisted. So it would be a 5 meter hold and a 10 to maybe a 5 to 10 to a 15 meter sprint. Then with your backs, you might be working over that sort of 5 to 7 meters with a hold and then letting them go and maybe running up to sort of that 15, 20, 25 meters without.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I think you're right. Sometimes people spend too long trying to get those perfect mechanics, and not actually developing the speed. And if it's already, it does the job already, that's efficient enough. I think sometimes they look at sprinters and see that perfect form and think everyone's got to have that, but you've got a limited training time with rugby players, so you've got to make sure you're getting your bang for your buck. So I think that's a really good point.
So many things going on, mate. So many different parts. So that's I guess the big thing is how do we integrate what we do with the coach.
Yeah, definitely. That's where it all sort of comes together and things really work, when the rugby stuff and the S&C is all tied in. So let's look at strength development a bit. What are your sort of go-to methods when trying to develop strength for rugby players?
I think with the athletes I'm working with at the moment, I operate 2 remote programs. So I've got the New Zealand women's rugby team, the Black Ferns, and I'm also looking after the rugby referees for New Zealand Rugby. So I've got 2 very different demographics there. I've got the referees who are a professional group. They can train day in, day out. They've got a relatively long season, so we look for sort of concurrent gains. So we're not trying to work on speed or aerobic or strength in any favour. We're trying to keep a pretty consistent baseline throughout the season. So one of our mottos is really we could test on any given day, and we're going to test to meet the standards that World Rugby set. Mm-hmm. We try and do a lot of strength work that complements their movement abilities as well. So we're dealing with an older demographic, and when I say older, I'm putting myself in that same category. Like that, we're dealing with largely sort of late 20s to late 30-year-olds who may or may not have a playing background. They're doing a lot of travelling. They maybe not as robust as what they used to be. So we're trying to develop tolerance through good strength training, exposing them to small amounts of plyometrics and speed training, all in sort of one session. On the other side of that, we've got the Black Ferns who have got a high variation in their training age. We've got athletes coming in straight out of school who are 17 and 18, training for the first time in a weights environment where we are looking to try and just develop their core lifts and spend a fair bit of time in that hypertrophy stage just trying to get things right. And on the other scale, we've got athletes that have been around the game for a decade, and I won't say it's maintenance. We're always looking to improve, but how we treat those athletes in their regions is quite different. We're fortunate that we've got really good support from the provincial unions in New Zealand Rugby, where we've got training hubs set up. So my role overseeing that program is to work with those 9 different PUs and try and guide them along, looking to our pinnacle events, which this year is the World Cup in August.
Yeah, so you sort of said previously off air before about planning for your pre-World Cup camp. What sort of things have you got in store, if you're happy to give them away?
Yeah, mate, I'm happy to share. I think I'm a believer in you can give people the ingredients to bake a cake, but it doesn't stop them burning it. We've got 52 athletes been identified in January after we come back from our tour of England and Ireland last year. We reselected our squad, and there was a bit of movement in that. Those 52 athletes now are in those 9 provincial unions getting contact time with a strength and conditioning coach and a skills coach. But again, they are holding down full-time jobs. They've got families, they're studying, so they're not professional by any stretch. The closest we've got to a professional athlete, some of the athletes coming back from sevens who have made themselves available for the 15 selection this year. So periodically, we'll go around those regions and we'll have national camps. So we had a 2-day camp last weekend where all the players come into a central location. They got exposed to the Black Ferns coaches as well as some S&C work and the nutritionist. So it's a good sort of chance to eyeball the athlete and see where they're at. But a lot of the legwork, a lot of the groundwork has actually been done back in the regional unions, which we rely on heavily.
Yeah. Now, you've kind of mentioned already, the monitoring that you do with the export and how you've used that into applying it into speed training. How do you see the use of GPS technology evolving in rugby, possibly in line with some of the things we were talking about previously about the change in the physical characteristics of rugby players?
I think the biggest thing is with anything, whether it's a training method, you asked about strength before, or whether now we're talking about technology, it's just reminding ourselves to be simple and effective. And sometimes we maybe over-engineer a solution and it becomes too complicated. And I think technology is a good example of that, whereby we're probably now starting to get past just collecting numbers. And the little units themselves are collecting 1 million data points every 90 minutes per athlete. They're generating 270 to 300 columns of data. And it's just in no one's best interest when you're trying to make decisions on the grass and trying to win games on a Saturday to even consider looking at all those different columns. So refining it down to look at what's relevant. And as we've already talked about, things like accelerations and collisions are big rocks for us. They're things that we know if we monitor well, we can introduce those into our weekly routines. We can give the athletes better tolerance to those types of loads, those types of metrics, and really avoid the interesting numbers. Like it's interesting that the heart beats 13,500 times during a game, but no one's going to do anything with that number. Yeah. It's interesting that the blood goes around the body 270 times in the game, but no one's going to do anything with that number.
Yeah.
So it's just trying to find what metrics matter and how we can use it day to day.
And could you give I know all environments are different, could you give an insight into what might be some of the key bits of data they'd look at? Or you've obviously already mentioned acceleration and decelerations.
Yeah, that and I think our high intensity distance covered is still a relative one that we look at across positions. I know there's a bit of debate at the moment whether or not we look at total distance covered or potentially we look at the metabolic equivalent distance. And that's sort of an interesting one for me at the moment. I'm not putting a huge amount of emphasis on it, but it's interesting because it sort of encompasses the accelerations and decelerations and has an offset added to the distance. So I think that's maybe an area that I will look at later on. But it's also working with the coach to try and understand if I'm going to measure something new, how does that relate to their game plan and how does that relate to maybe a technical or tactical piece of data? And I think with the things like acceleration may relate to better line speed. High intensity distance covered might relate to having a better tempo or arriving at the breakdown a little bit faster. And then it becomes, well, you're getting to more breakdowns. Is that affecting your accuracy? And trying to work out sort of which metrics match up with others.
Yeah, definitely. And this just kind of another question, because some people do it differently when they monitor, obviously for speed and moving into the high intensity stuff. What's your opinion? Should you do it relative to the individual speed or look at it as an absolute measure?
I don't think it hugely matters as long as you're consistent. If you know, as an example, that all the players' high intensity speed benchmark is, say it's 15 k's an hour, that's a reasonably common number. If we say we're measuring that and we know that all the outside backs tend to end up somewhere between 20 and 23% of high intensity distance, that's their norm. If we know that the tighties are somewhere between 10 and 12.5%, well, that becomes their norm. That's one approach. On the other side of things, if you're looking at workload, we can't then always give our outside backs a bias by creating a workload number that favours them. And by that I mean if we only measure number of sprints, high intensity distance, number of accelerations, you're likely going to always end up with your outside backs having high workload numbers. But if you add in other variables like collisions, all of a sudden that starts to favour your tighties that are going through more collisions in the game, and it starts to balance out. So I think it's important to, yes, have relative standards where it's appropriate, like in workload. But if you're looking, trying to set thresholds, and you haven't done monitoring before, setting absolute numbers is actually okay. It's as you refine your process, you'll move up and down a kilometre here and there. But starting with something that's constant is probably a good place to be.
Yeah, really good advice. Now, this is a question we ask all our guests on the podcast. What do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
Trying to do too much. So in terms of get your big rocks in place, agree on what those things are for you, understanding you don't need to be a 10 out of 10 in every different discipline, and then you can always add the sand in later on. So you try and pour sand into a glass first and then add the big rocks later. They never fit. But just get your non-negotiables in place first and pour the sand in later is probably my best piece of advice. I know guys like Nick Gill talk about they set their program, they implement their program, and they evaluate it, and it's just a constant cycle. Program, implement, evaluate, and let's keep on repeating. And I think we don't need lots and lots of variation to see improvement. Variation satisfies the athlete because it keeps things interesting and fun, but repetitions in terms of lifting and exercise and skills is really how we perfect things. So it's just trying to find that balance between the fun aspect and getting the repetitions that you need.
Yeah, and it's difficult because rugby is one of those sports where you need, certain levels of all physical qualities. So, there's so many things you've got to cover off. But yeah, you're right. You've got to find out what are the most important things for that athlete, that position, and focus on those. So moving on, what sort of advice would you give to an upcoming strength and conditioning coach?
I think find some good mentors. There's plenty of guys out there that in the game at the moment have been doing things for a long time, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Do less things better. So I think your Tim Gabbetts, your Martin Bouchers, those sort of people are really good to look at. Tim Gabbett obviously doing a huge amount of really good work at the moment in the workload space around acute and chronic loads. I think it's something that's going to have a lot of impact and longevity in our game. He's got some really good analogies, Tim. I think he talks about how beer, when drinking beer, relates to workload. I mean, you may have heard this one already, but he says when you have a spike in your beer load, so you have a big bender, you tend to get hangovers. But if beer's not really the problem; it's the beer that you prepare for. And training's like that. It's a tolerance, and trying to expose your athletes to the right level of tolerance without overdoing it is key. So yeah, I like where Tim's at with that. The other guy to have a look at that gives away lots and lots of good resources is a guy called John Life. John is probably a self-confessed sports geek Excel guru. And with the amount of data that's out there, trying to find ways to bring that data together for a young S&C is crucial. And John's a really good one for giving away free resources and got a good YouTube page that I think they would find really interesting.
Yeah, I've definitely spent hours watching those YouTube videos, helping me get through spreadsheets. I agree. We've had Tim as a guest on the podcast, and yeah, his analogies are great. I think if you can apply anything to drinking, rugby players tend to understand it better. But on that, not all players, really enjoy strength and conditioning, as much as we do. How do you go about sort of dealing with a player who perhaps just prefers going out and doing the rugby stuff and doesn't really focus on their S&C? How do you get more buy-in from the player?
I think there's two ways to do it. The first way is through the coach and having that really good integrated approach through bouncing a 5-minute conditioning window with a skill acquisition task. And so we try and do that a lot with Glenn Moore, who I'm working with at the moment with the Black Ferns, and really enjoy working with Glenn in terms of how we can do that successfully. So finding a theme for the session, whether it's line speed again might be the example, where I can get some accelerations and decelerations as part of my conditioning into his part of his his skill program as well. And probably the other theory I live by, if you ever want to create frequency, you've got to have some fun. So trying to find ways that we can do that through game-based conditioning. And the second way is they're athletes that are competitive. The moment you create competition in your drills, whether it's through a ladder or making them run out to 20 metres but getting chased by someone, the moment they get chased, it becomes a competition. It creates intensity. So if you can create frequency through fun and intensity through competition, frequency and intensity generally get you a good outcome. So just trying to be, I guess, resourceful in that way, and also integrating with your coach.
Yeah, that's some great advice there. And are there any, going back to our kind of upcoming strength and conditioning coach, are there any sort of books or resources other than the XL Tricks of Sports that you mentioned? Any books you'd recommend for them?
Oh, look, I think the thing is, it's rather than books, it's sort of trying to increase your network by getting on your LinkedIn and your social media pages, and when you are going to a different country, reaching out to an S&C coach. We're all pretty approachable. I know we are all stretched for time, but generally speaking, if a young guy is persistent and they come back with you with good questions and creating that sort of dialogue and asking the questions they want to know about, it's very hard, I think, picking up a book and just finding the answer to the things that you really want to know. So maybe trying to build your network that way. When you go to conferences, it's great listening to some of these guys speak, but try and hang around in those sort of down times and find those people that are happy to have a coffee with you and share ideas. And I think there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of guys around the world now who I know would go and do their PD not just to a conference, but they will tag on a visit to another team, and they'll share ideas that way. And it doesn't need to be in your sport. It doesn't need to be rugby. There's amazing programs in the AFL. There's great resources around cricket or in the European football scene. So it's just a matter of trying to find guys you relate to and ask the questions that you want to know the answers to.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. Conferences, I think you tend to come away from them thinking you got more from the actual networking than you do from the actual lectures and things. And it goes back to your previous answers. That's the best way to build, get mentors and things like that. And also, yeah, don't be afraid to look at other sports, because there's so many, good sports teams doing, things that we can apply in rugby. There's no reason to be sort of closed off and just sort of look at other rugby teams. So it's great advice. Lastly, Jamie, where can people learn more about yourself?
So I've got a couple of active sites. vxsport.com is sort of the athlete monitoring we've got going on at the moment, doing some really cool things, I think, at the moment around managing that chronic and acute load. Also, acceleratesportstraining.com. And we offer on acceleratesportstraining.com a couple of online courses for speed and agility training. And also there is a mentor program on there as well that people can reach out and tap into if they so wish.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. We will, of course, share links to both of those in the show notes. And all the best with the World Cup with the Black Ferns.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Jamie. Thanks for your time, mate.
Cheers, Jamie. So there you go, another great podcast, and we'd like to thank Jamie for taking the time to talk to us and share his insights into his career, and wish him all the best with the Black Ferns in the World Cup in the summer. In the meantime, please subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher or TuneIn, and give us a 5-star review. And of course, keep checking us out at rugbyrenegades.com for upcoming articles and videos, trying to get a lot more video content out for you. And of course, check out the online subscription program where we put strength conditioning and injury prevention together to get you stronger, fitter, faster, and stay injury free so you can dominate your opposition on the rugby field.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.